the Polgar Chess University. It's true that we already spoke about pins in some of the previous lessons, but as I promised earlier, I am getting back to the various themes over and over. After all, the number of themes in chess are limited. However, we can never stop learning about them. Even masters or grandmasters constantly are learning new ideas. You start with basic ones and you build on that. I'd like to share with you first a famous game by one of the former world champions, Botvinnik, against Kann. This is the position they have reached after 21 moves into the game. It looks like a pretty normal position. There is material balance. Neither side has any material advantage. Here are how we evaluate the position. White has control of the open d file. That's a good thing. White has a bishop versus black's knight. That's also generally a good thing considering the fact that there are pawns on both sides of the board. White also has a pin over black's rook on f7. So that's already 3 pluses for white. Now, what can we tell on the black side? The good thing on the black side is that the black queen is aiming at white's king, and white has a little bit of a weakness on the light squares around the king. So, for example, if the black pawn would be able to come up to f3 followed by a queen h3, potentially there could be some checkmate ideas on g2. Of course, things are by no means simple for black to achieve that because of white's pawn being on e2. Another potential idea that black may have is to bring one of the rooks to aid the queen to the h file to h6, and so put pressure attack on h2. At the moment, though, I have to admit, black's plans are rather futuristic, and it's not clear how and if they can even make it happen. However, if black is being given the time, for example, moving out of the pin and then move the rook up, indeed, those ideas could happen. So white needs to act here and now by keeping black busy and not giving black the time to further his own plans. And this is how white continued. White pushed his b pawn up by attacking the black knight, keeping his opponent busy. Now black has to be very careful. Whether moving the knight right away or after a trade of pawns, which black did in the game, it does not particularly matter. The ideas will be very similar. Black in the game did a trade and then moved his knight to a5. Let's examine for a moment what would happen if the knight would go elsewhere. For example, if the knight would go to d8, for one to protect the rook on f7 and then maybe trying to come to e6, at first not looking too bad, but as so often in chess, we can accomplish our strategic goals because of tactical elements. And this is no exception. It's one of those wonderful examples when white now immediately has a tactical motive that allows white an elegant combination to use black's back rank weakness. I hope by now you figured out what I was hinting at, and it is namely queen capturing the rook. Even though it's a queen sacrifice, the end result will be a nice checkmate. Let's go back and see what would happen if, on the other hand, in this position, the black knight would not go to d8, but would go to e7. This has a similar problem namely the back rank problem, because after white's capturing of the knight, the rook on f7 is still pinned, while if the other rook captures the bishop, then the white queen coming down to d8 guarantees winning at least a rook, because after the rook from f7 would retreat, the rook on e7 can be captured. That is the explanation why the black knight in the game went to a5. Of course, a5 is away from all action, whether defending the black center pawns or the king's side, or trying to participate in the attack against white's king. As the typical saying goes, knights don't belong on the edge of the board. When they do, usually that's only in transition to go to a better central square. And in this case, white again can use the element of the back rank problem to his advantage and to indeed take advantage of the pin. So again, here white is combining two elements, the pin and the back rank problem, and in fact, using a third element as well, removing the guard. Try to figure out what white's elegant move is coming up. And that move is queen to e6. Brilliant move, attacking the black rook on e8, as the white queen is taboo, cannot be captured safely, because the white rook would move down to d8 again, and then checkmate within 2 moves after that. Black moved his rook away from the attack to the corner, protecting his knight on a5 against any future attacks. And now, finally, we get to the theme of this lesson, namely using the pin. And here we go. The white rook just can move in now to d7, putting further pressure on the black rook on f7, and because that rook is pinned, at the same time it also attacks black's c7 pawn. White is also threatening to simply double up his rooks on the d file and then again use the back rank weakness of black's. If in this position black would play queen f5, forcing the exchange of queens, then indeed white would not mind that trade because would win at least a pawn immediately. Then if rook f7, king f7, white would play rook c1 with the idea to then move the bishop away and enter with a new rook on the 7th rank. And also, quite importantly, with rook c1, we prevent the activization of the black knight from a5 coming to c4. Quite important. And what again a tactical motive, after rook c8, when black would be pinning the white bishop, the bishop could get out of the pin easily, for example, after the trade, playing bishop e3, because now the bishop protects the rook, and white should be winning easily with an extra pawn. Let's go back again to the game position, where black responded, still trying to trade queens, but doing the same from queen g6. Big difference though, that here if white would trade the queens, white would not win a pawn because the black rook would remain on f7. So therefore, white simply wants to maintain the pin by playing queen d5. And in fact, this move does more than that. Besides the fact that it maintains the pin, it created a threat of a back rank checkmate by playing rook to d8 next. Black was pretty much forced to open a little window for his king to escape from that check on h7. But now white is free to capture the pawn on c7. White basically has already a winning position. Also, the e5 pawn is in big trouble, which black was trying to protect by playing rook to e8. And here the simplest win for white was, instead of bishop b4, which happened in the game, to play bishop b6. Even though it seems that the black queen controls that square, that's of course deceiving, because the black queen is indeed busy guarding the rook on f7 and cannot afford to capture white's bishop. Black is quite lost in this position because the knight pretty much is trapped on a5, as protecting the knight with rook a8 would not really protect it, because white could, for example, trade on a5, followed by a trade on f7, and then we have an unprotected piece on a5. White is ready to move down with the queen check, forking the rook and winning. I have to add, though, that even after the inferior bishop b4, in the actual game, white had a major advantage, and after bishop b4 and b6, and then trading on a5, playing b6, white won the game in not that many more moves anyway. Okay, now let's move on to a bit more concrete and tactical examples on the theme of the pin. Here we go. In this position, again, we have material balance, and we have a similar piece distribution as in the previous example, except that there are no queens on the board and there are only one pair of rooks. This position seems, even just looking at the position without any calculation, slightly better for black. Why would I say that? I would say that because black has a bishop versus white's knight, and as I mentioned before, in situations when there are pawns on both sides of the board, that means that can and usually will be action on both sides of the board, the bishop is superior over the knight usually. Also, black's pawns are more advanced. See the ones on a4 and b4. They put pressure on white in certain situations, and especially because the black bishop from the corner is aiming at white's b2 pawn. We can also see that the black rook is more active than its counterpart, being on a completely open file, and in fact kind of tying down the white rook to g2, needing to guard to entry point on f2, making sure that black rook doesn't end up there, because if it would win white's b2 pawn. With all that being said, black needs to look for something concrete in this case. It's very important to always be aware of our tactical opportunities, and in this case that means creating a pin. Moving the rook to g8 looks like a harmless move, even though it creates a pin. However, it actually is a winning move. White cannot save his knight. Black now has an obvious threat to move the bishop to e5 and to attack white's knight. And then if the knight moves away, the white rook will be lost because it's on an unprotected square. But white can attempt to save the day still. Can you find that move for white? Well, that move is moving the rook back to g1. Remember this idea. And now, if the black bishop indeed moves to e5, attacking the white knight, the knight can go to a square which will protect the rook on g1, and actually white will be quite safe. Let's go back to this position and see what should black do. Black has a very fine move to kind of lose a tempo on purpose and get their bishop to e5 in 2 moves instead of 1. Namely, we want to force that rook back to the light square to g2 by attacking it, and then only move to bishop e5, and now white is hopeless. White is losing the knight. Let's move on to another example played by Grandmasters Yusupov and Nikolic. They have reached this position in the game, and it was white's turn. It's a bit of a complex tactical situation going on here. For example, if white captures the black bishop, black will capture the white knight and will be reasonably well. How about if white tries to give an intermediate check either from d8 or e5? In either case, the black king will move out to a square where it will attack that knight anyway, and then again, if rook takes bishop, king takes knight, and black is hanging on. Same would happen after knight e5 check, and then king f6. So what should white do? If white moves the knight away to some random square such as d4, the black bishop is free to go, and again there is material balance and the game will most likely end in a draw. But white has a winning move here, a winning sequence, and this requires calculation. The correct sequence is playing bishop takes knight on e4. Now, if the black pawn simply recaptures, then already white has 2 intermediate checks that will result in winning a piece, namely checking from e5, and then after king f6, which attacks the knight will go to g4, a second check, king f5, and capture the bishop. It's also quite important to see that this is not quite the end of the story, because black can try to check, and after king h2, play h5 and trap the white knight. But fortunately for white in this case, white, even though the knight is trapped at the moment, can rescue it by first checking black's king, and then the knight is free to move to e5. Let's go back and see another variation. What could happen after pawn takes back, knight e5 check, and what if after now rook takes bishop, black would try to play h5 right away? Well, on one hand, white could simply do the same and give a check with rook b5, which would be the best move, but I also just wanted to mention that white doesn't need to worry even to come back to h2, because after the rook check, the knight can block the check. Okay, so let's get back again and see why am I showing this example in this chapter. Because namely, black can try a different and in fact better move by moving the bishop to a4. With the idea that now if the white bishop moves away, black will capture white's knight on c6. Or if knight check on e5, again king f6 attacking the knight. However, here is the problem that black has, namely that after bishop f3 and the bishop capturing the knight on c6, white has a pin. So it's quite important to foresee pinning opportunities, because oftentimes if you want to especially trick your more experienced opponents, you need to foresee it 2, 3 or more moves ahead, just like in this case. In the actual game, black instead captured the knight with the rook, but that of course simply resulted white capturing the rook and white remaining an exchange ahead. White won shortly. Let's move on to our next example. This is a famous endgame by Nimzowitsch. It's a perfect illustration of how powerful a pin can be. In this position, white is a pawn ahead. However, in endgames with very little material, that oftentimes is not enough to win the game. For example, in this position, if white would blindly capture everything on f6 and start pushing his pawns, the black king would be sufficiently close to catch the pawn before the pawns would promote. And whether the pawn now pushes through or recaptures, the king is catching the pawn. So how can white still win here? Remember this pattern, it's extremely important. White would capture with the rook first, putting the black rook in a pin, and then make an advancement with the pawn on the b file. Now, if black wants to get out of the pin, they need to lose a move by moving the king, and now when bishop takes rook, that meant that the black king indeed captured back in 2 moves, while white got a chance to advance his pawn, and now the black king is just 1 move too late, because after b6 and pawn takes, white does not recapture but pushes the pawn through, and now the white pawn obviously advances, promotes much faster than black's pawn. Let's see another example that beautifully illustrates the power of a pin. In this position, black seems to have tremendous material advantage that normally should easily guarantee a win. In fact, if white would now capture the black rook on e6, black rook would recapture and have, of course, a very simply winning game. Yet miraculously, white can save this game by moving the bishop to f3, and the poor rook on e4 is in an eternal pin. Anytime the king moves, the rook can be captured. The same would go anywhere the rook would go other than on the e-file. And if the rook remains on the e-file, white will just make waiting moves, and black cannot make progress. Of course, that's based on the understanding and fact that in most endgames, rook versus bishop are a draw. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. In this position, black has a queen, although white has a rook and knight as compensation. White also has a very dangerous, far advanced passed pawn on f7. And in fact, that is white's hope. The challenge is that if white moves the rook out of the pawn's way to some random square, trying to promote the pawn on the following move, black will play queen d5 check and then pick up the pawn. Also, moving the rook away with a check wouldn't help, because the black queen would capture the pawn and blocking the promotion square. I suggest you take your time and try to figure out on your own the brilliant solution. And here it comes. The correct starting move is to play rook to b8. Obviously, if king captures rook, the pawn promotes with a check, leaving white with an extra knight, which should be a relatively easy win. Therefore, black plays check on d5. And after the king moves out, captures the pawn. So how on earth will white win this game? Brilliantly, giving a check, forcing the black king to the corner, and now using our theme of the day, a brilliant move, knight c6, threatening checkmate from both directions with the rook. The knight cannot be captured because of the pin, the queen would be lost. And if the king takes the rook, then we use another theme, the fork. Well, I hope you enjoyed this brilliant endgame and of course the rest of the examples. Remember, pins are one of the most dangerous tactical tools in chess. Try to use them to your benefit and avoid getting into them. If you're in it, try to get out of it as soon as you can. Thank you for listening. So long until next week.